This presentation is part of the academic webinar series of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. To view a full catalog of our past presentations and for a schedule of our upcoming webinars, please visit nonviolent-conflict.org and click on the Learning and Resources tab. Hello everyone, and welcome to the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict academic webinar series. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jake Fitzpatrick, and I'm the Content Development Associate at ICNC. And today's webinar is titled, How Communities Use Nonviolent Strategies to Avoid Civil War Violence, and will be presented by Dr. Oliver Kaplan, who is a lecturer in human rights at the Josef Korbel School at the University of Denver. And today's presentation will be around 30 to 40 minutes in length and will be followed by 20 to 30 minutes of questions and answers. Dr. Oliver Kaplan joined the faculty of the Josef Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver as a lecturer in human rights in 2012. Kaplan will be teaching courses on human rights and foreign policy, peace building and civil wars, and civilian protection in the 2012-2013 academic year. He was previously a postdoctoral research associate at Princeton University in the Woodrow Wilson School working with the Empirical Studies of Conflict Project, and was a postdoctoral researcher at Stanford University from 2010 to 2011. His main research interests included the study of alternative conflict resolution and counterinsurgency strategies. His book project, Civilian Autonomy in Civil War, examines how civilian communities organize to protect themselves from wartime violence and received the Diskin Dissertation Award, honorable mention, from the Latin American Studies Association. He identifies strategies civilians may use to influence armed groups and illustrates when these strategies are effective and when they may fail. To test his arguments, Kaplan conducted statistical analyses and fieldwork-based case studies of communities in Colombia that highlight the protective effects of village councils. He is currently working on additional projects on the link between land and conflict and post-conflict state consolidation processes. His research has been funded by the Smith-Richardson Foundation and other grants and has been published in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, Journal of Peace Research, the New York Times, Foreign Policy, and National Interest. Kaplan received his PhD in political science from Stanford University and completed his BA at UC San Diego. You can see some of Oliver's recent writings by visiting the blog Political Violence at a Glance. And finally, be sure to follow him on Twitter using the handle @OliverKaplan. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Kaplan.
Okay, great. I hope everybody can hear me. Thanks a lot, Jake, for that introduction. I'd like to say welcome to everybody around the world who's tuning in. I think this is a really great platform to reach people. So greetings from Denver, and I'd like to say thank you also to the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. I think, again, it's a real honor to be able to present in this webinar series. So what I'm going to present to you today is a project and presentation called How Communities Use Nonviolent Strategies to Avoid Civil War Violence. Now this project is based in part on the doctoral research I did and based on a lot of field work I did as well in Colombia and more recently in the Philippines, not to mention some extensive and obsessive reading of cases of civilians acting in the face of armed groups from around the world. So with that, I have a lot of material to cover today, so I'm going to get started with the content of the presentation. And so I'd like to begin by framing the puzzle that I'm going to address today. And the main puzzle I'm going to look at is, do nonviolent strategies provide protection against heavily armed violent actors? Now this really is a puzzle because it is in fact surprising that civilians without weapons could actually influence armed actors who may be very intent on using violence. So this is the puzzle I'm going to address throughout the presentation. This puzzle has to do very closely with what has often been called the culture of peace, or having local communities act peacefully. But in some sense, this is either a misnomer or a concept that isn't very clearly defined. So part of the work I'm going to do today is to unpack what the culture of peace is, how it works, and actually add some flesh to the bones of the culture of peace. So today I'm largely going to be talking about nonviolent strategies during conflicts, and I'm going to think about what the goals of those strategies are. I'm going to primarily consider how civilians seek autonomy for their communities, or in other words, how they retain local decision-making and self-rule. Oftentimes, local communities don't have strong interests or preferences for fighting in particular conflicts, and in fact, they just want to stay out of conflicts and survive. And so the question there becomes, how can the great number of moderate residents of communities isolate extremists who might use violence? And I'd like to just point out that this topic is actually slightly different from most of the topics that the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict studies and focuses on. A lot of the literature and interest in nonviolent strategies often has to do with unseating repressive regimes or protesting for greater rights. And in this case, it's a little different. One, because civilians are facing highly armed actors, whether they be state actors or non-state actors. And it's also different because they really do have, it's in a sense, limited goals, and they want to survive. So civilian communities may in fact prefer democracy and greater rights protection, but their very immediate goals, how do they develop strategies to help them survive? And so today I'm going to do an inventory of those strategies. And I'm mostly going to go over theories of these strategies and document a bit about how they work. I'm not going to go into a great extent of the empirical research on how whether these strategies actually work, which can be something to discuss in the question and answer session or for a future presentation. And I'd also like to note as an introductory note that these strategies that civilians use in wartime are very difficult to document and analyze. In a sense, they are really the dogs that don't bark. They are the strategies that we don't see because oftentimes the emphasis of reporting in wartime is on violence and not the absence of violence. And so just having these strategies documented, I think, will help people be more sensitive and aware of what strategies are out there. And so a question arises based on that, on the puzzle of why is it surprising and why don't we see more civilian responses to armed actors than we actually see? And so civilians in armed conflicts face several challenges, one of which is that humanitarian interventions by outside actors tend to be rare and they tend to be weak. And this often means that civilians are left to their own devices to try to figure out ways to get by. Unfortunately, individuals also face danger confronting belligerents, especially when they're alone. They are at great risk in standing up to belligerents. However, acting together, individuals also face a free rider problem. They may gain greater protection by acting together, but taking action as an individual is dangerous, and if other people can contribute to providing that protection, you might be better off. And so the result of that is that people, unless they're very highly coordinated, aren't able to provide what is essentially the public good of community protection. So that public good is underprovided. And so even if all residents might have pacifist preferences and want to avoid armed conflict, they may be afraid to act and need reassurance. And so today I'm going to talk about how civilians go about solving this problem, and then once they've solved this problem, what do they actually do to protect themselves? And so for an outline for today, first I'm going to give a brief introduction to nonviolence during conflict, as opposed to after conflict or prior to conflict, or simply for protesting a regime. My apologies, everybody. So first I'm going to give a brief introduction to nonviolence during conflict, as opposed to prior to conflict, after conflict, or simply to advocate for greater rights or against a repressive regime. Then I'm briefly going to talk about the theories of violence, because it's very important to understand why violence occurs in order to address violence and tamp it down. Third, I'm going to give a brief inventory of the different community protection strategies that I've documented in Colombia, in the Philippines, and also around the world. And then I'm going to go ahead and compare these strategies for when we might see them, when they're used, and see if we can make sense of them. Fifth, I'm going to provide a little background on the logics of armed actor responses. So how do these strategies affect armed actor decision-making about the use of violence? And then I'll briefly conclude with some final observations. So in this introductory section, I'm just going to go over two things. First, I'm going to show a little information about the breadth of these nonviolent movements, which I think are actually much broader than people recognize. And then I'm going to talk about the importance of the role of community cooperation and organization for facilitating strategies to deal with violence. So in this slide, I have a map that I've created where I've done my best to document cases of collective actions for protection in civil conflicts around the world. And you can see that this is a broad coding of cases. Here they're showing about 13 cases, or about a quarter of countries that had civil conflicts since 1980, so it's actually quite broad. This doesn't necessarily mean that every community in each country is acting up, but they're at least examples of communities taking actions on their own behalf to protect themselves against belligerents. And some of the more prominent and diverse cases are listed on the left there. So Colombia, the Philippines, Afghanistan. You even see cases in Russia, Mexico, even the Vietnam War, Congo, and Mozambique all had different movements at different levels of intensity where civilians tried to protect themselves. And so the point of this slide is that actually this is quite a broad phenomenon, although as I mentioned, these are, again, are the dogs that don't bark. So there are likely many more examples of this kind of action, and in fact I've since I made this map have even coded examples in additional countries. So that point is just to say that this is actually occurring quite broadly. So now I'm going to talk about the power of organization. The power of the civilian organization at the local level really is a key to being able to implement strategies for protection. And so the causal schematic I have at the top of this slide shows how organization enables strategies which in turn affect the outcome of violence. And really when we're talking about the outcome of violence, we're talking about armed actors and how strategies affect armed actors themselves. So that's what we're going to be thinking about. And so again, lone individuals are vulnerable. A single attack against a lone individual ends their ability to deal with violence. By contrast, community organization is extremely helpful to help civilians cooperate and overcome that free rider problem that I diagnosed earlier in the presentation. In conflict zones, you tend to see two types of organizations being used to deal with violence. The first kind are formal peace organizations, and so these are organizations that were formed precisely to deal with conflict. These have been variably named peace zones, peace communities, humanitarian spaces. There are a number of names for these kinds of organizations, but they're very verbally, formally announced organizations trying to deal with violence. On the other hand, you also have a lot of informal organizations that are not specifically intended for protection, but end up being leveraged for protection and enable strategies as well. And so across the world, you see that there are village councils, economic cooperatives, local religious institutions, and many other organizations that help civilians come together when the fighting starts. And so here's just an example of one organization building that I documented in a community in Colombia. This is a community store that was run by a network of village councils in central Colombia. And one point to make here is that really these kinds of pre-existing organizations are very helpful because organizing during a conflict once threats are there can be very challenging. And so to the extent that communities can leverage pre-existing organizations, they have a better chance of dealing with armed groups. So let's just take a minute now and talk about what these organizations actually do and how they help civilians mobilize these protective strategies and deal with violence. And so organizations and other forms of cooperation and cohesion help civilians in a number of ways. First of all, they help provide them with greater decision-making capacity, so how to deal with changing situations. Second of all, they provide or they give communities an ability to manage information about changing conflict conditions, what individuals in the communities may be doing, how much support there is for different strategies, even information about the public forces and where armed groups are moving. So third, they also, these institutions or local organizations provide an opportunity for collective memory and learning. And so they're able to group experiences and insights from across a community and even learn examples from other communities to try to best adapt to local conditions. Fourth, and perhaps the most obviously of this presentation, is they actually are helpful structures for implementing collective strategies and advocating on behalf of the community, so as a collective. And then fifth, perhaps this goes without saying, but these institutions are far more resilient to threats than individuals are, who may face a threat and immediately have to displace, whereas if an individual in an organization is threatened, they can perhaps displace for a while, but the organization goes on. So a question that stems out of this is, okay, which organizations matter? What kinds of organizations are most helpful for dealing with violence? And this is some of my theoretical thinking, which I think is perhaps straightforward. There could be other characteristics, but I'm going to go over some of these characteristics. And so my argument is that some organizations provide civilians with better prospects to deal with violence than others. So certain organizational characteristics of these local community organizations help to either, one, enhance the capacity of that organization to act. Two, they help limit spoilers who might be collaborating with armed groups or may not agree with the peaceful cause of the community. And third, they help avoid retaliation based on how they're positioned. And so some of the organizational characteristics that I've identified, which I believe to be helpful, are one, a strong decision-making capacity. So for example, a local council that is experienced making community decisions might be more helpful than a mere cooperative where people are just exchanging goods. These organizations, to the extent that they're legitimate and are believed in by a broad cross-section of the people, help limit spoilers and also increase the capacity to implement strategies. And so if you could think about just a local democratic council that is very inclusive and respected by the community, it'll also empower the leaders of that organization and help them to deal with external threats from armed groups. Third, the breadth of coverage of these organizations is very helpful. So to the extent that they are all-encompassing of the residents in their community or in their region, it helps to limit spoilers and be more inclusive so that individuals feel like they're excluded from a particular decision-making process and therefore might feel the urge to defect to aid armed groups. And lastly, this is perhaps a controversial one, but to the extent that local organizations can remain apolitical and not get sucked into the macro cleavages of armed conflicts, they're able to have a better chance at avoiding retaliation from one party of a conflict or another. So this is all these reasons are why organizations can actually provide some benefits to dealing with armed conflict violence. Now let's get into the second section, and this is just going to be a quick section reviewing why civilians are killed in conflict. And these reasons, again, they're going to help us understand when civilian strategies might be helpful for dealing with these causes of violence. And so I'm just going to go over 4 of the main ones here. And so perhaps the most frightening one is genocide and draining of the sea. And this is essentially massive, indiscriminate violence used either to eliminate a group or often in counterinsurgency. As Valentino argues, this is used as a last resort to deal with rebels that they aren't able to target through other means. And so oftentimes the civilian population gets targeted for removal. A second theory of why civilians are killed comes from Weinstein, and this is essentially has to do with rebel indiscipline and abuse. And so rebel groups that are opportunistic and economically motivated frequently have deterioration in their discipline structures and end up committing abuses against civilians. So it's not necessarily strategic violence that's occurring. A third kind, which is quite common and quite obvious, is collateral damage. And so just errant bombs, unintended fighting that causes unintended harm to civilians, so civilians caught literally in the crossfire of a battle and those kinds of things. And then another form of violence which has been presented by Kalivas is selective targeting or selective violence. And so here either rebel groups, governments, paramilitary groups use coercion and use violence to coerce civilians through fear according to where they have the most control. And the idea is that through coercion you can convince civilians to support your cause and deter them from collaborating with the enemy. And really here the idea is that armed groups can prey on the cleavages within communities and prey on local disputes to get denunciations of enemy collaborators and therefore shore up their own power. Now, these theories are helpful because they give us some sense of the scope conditions for when strategies to deal with violence might be helpful. And I'm going to argue that in general, the mechanisms that civilians have at their disposal and the strategies are most useful for solving problems of selective violence of the kind argued by Kalivas, although there are cases where other forms of violence can be dealt with, but they require much stronger forms of organization and entail different kinds of risks. So, okay, I'm going to move on now and talk about the different strategies I identified. So this is the inventory of nonviolent strategies, and essentially these are what you would call weapons of the weak for conflict settings, to use the language that was used by James Scott in his study of peasant communities. And so I've primarily identified 5 strategies, and so there could be more strategies than this. I think that these 5 are likely the most common, and they also subsume a number of other strategies. And so there could be, for example, cultural acts of resistance and artistic expressions and other things. But here I'm really focusing on and particularly interested in which strategies are most effective and in the sense that they affect armed group behavior. And so really which ones deal with problems created by armed groups. Some of these strategies may be mutually exclusive. For example, a protest movement and trying to manage information in cooperation with armed groups may not always work together, but some are not, so you could also have dispute resolution combined with the propagation of norms. So I'm going to go ahead and analyze these briefly one by one, and then we'll compare them. So to begin with, these strategies can be grouped into more or less 2 different categories. One are subtle, what you would literally call weapons of the weak. So basically strategies that deal with managing communities and managing communities' involvement in the conflict. And these kinds of strategies, the first grouping, which I'll go over, are indirect strategies of influence. And oftentimes armed actors may not even be aware that the community is taking these actions. Another set of actions is overt protest. And so these are direct interactions with armed groups, perhaps dialogue, or direct actions against armed groups, including protest or other actions that armed groups may not be very favorable towards. Here I also need to mention some alternative strategies to these nonviolent autonomy strategies which I've documented. And these are civilians perhaps doing nothing or displacing. So civilians may not take any action, or the risks may be so great that civilians displace from an area. And oftentimes this is in fact a safest option. And we see that there of course has been massive displacement during armed conflicts around the world. So this is quite a common strategy, but for our purposes the question is, what can civilians do to avoid that kind of outcome and not displace and actually stay in their homes and stay safe? So a second strategy, which is not a nonviolent strategy, is arming. So local civilians may take up arms to use force to deter armed groups that would commit violence. And in this case, arming has certainly occurred at a local level. In fact, there has been recent news about this occurring across towns and villages in Mexico to deal with drug traffickers and deal with the absence of accountable police presence. But arming entails its own risks, and it doesn't really fit very well in this schematic. And so first of all, arming requires a lot of organization. It also risks great retaliation because civilians often are not trained to use military weapons or use firearms, and armed groups are able to overpower them unless there's really a very weak armed group and civilians are very well organized. And furthermore, arming often raises the question of whether or not these communities are still civilian communities and whether or not they are at that point taking part in the conflict. So I'm not going to talk too much about that strategy, but I did want to flag it here. Okay, so let's talk briefly about the first strategy. So the first strategy is dispute resolution or local harmony. And so this really has to do directly with the theory of violence, of selective violence. So in this case, oftentimes armed groups will prey on the disputes and divisions within communities to exert their authority. And by contrast, if there are harmonious relations among residents, fewer disputes among residents break out and fewer residents take these disputes to armed groups. And then furthermore, civilians, community leaders, conciliators within the community can take action, in fact, to actually resolve these disputes among citizens and therefore block armed group inroads. And so one example that we see today is the local coordinating committees in Syria, where they are essentially trying to reestablish civilian-led justice so that armed groups, whether they be Islamist, extremist groups, or whatever you'd like to call them, or other armed groups, are not the ones meting out justice. Instead, it's the civilians. And so, let's see. Let me go on to the next slide. Okay, so and here this is a picture from the town of Pennsylvania, of Columbia, where I did some field work. And here and elsewhere, village council leaders played important roles in managing conflicts within communities. And here, great picture, you can just see all the neighbors living next to each other in the town. And so the question is, can they get along so that armed groups can't take advantage of them? Okay. A second strategy are really norms of non-participation and norms of nonviolent. And so this really has to do with the ideas of that the community holds. And so communities can promote ideologies of pacifism, of nonviolence, of non-participation in the conflict. And some of these can come from just ideational beliefs. They can come from religious beliefs. They come from a variety of sources. But essentially this involves the idea that peacefully resolving disputes is better to conflict. And also community leaders can manage and incentivize the behavior of residents to avoid armed groups. And so they can create a common purpose. They can persuade people that joining armed groups is harmful and causes harm to the community. And they can also provide alternative activities, or another game in town, if you will, so that civilians, instead of joining armed groups, are participating and active in the community and don't see armed groups as an option. And this can be especially helpful when there are activities for youths who might otherwise be recruited. And so this strategy can help limit recruitment to armed groups and therefore limit the manpower available for them to make war. So one nice example I came across in the Philippines in some archival work is that in the Philippine peace zones, many of them have banned the carrying of weapons, or the norm that weapons should not be carried in the community, neither by residents nor by armed groups. And so this is just one example here of community-led gun control, but there are other examples as well. So, okay. The third strategy is the strategy of dialogue and investigations. And so this isn't so much a strategy of resistance or nonviolent resistance as it is nonviolent cooperation in a sense, or a nonviolent strategy to deal with information flows and try to reach a constructive outcome of less violence with armed groups. So for this mechanism, there are a number of premises that that establish why it might work. So first of all, you have to assume that violence is costly, both to armed groups and to communities. And so armed groups might suffer some kind of reputation effects or have some other reasons that they don't want to use violence. We can discuss those later. Second, civilian organizations often have advantages in local information over the armed groups, and so they're better able to identify who is collaborating with armed groups and who's not, and especially who's collaborating with an enemy of one of the armed groups. And so third, the armed groups value this information precisely because for them they have difficulty in policing defections. They don't have the information, they don't often have the access, but yet they're worried about what the civilian population is doing and whether or not they're supporting one of their enemy groups. So if you have these three conditions, civilians are actually able to provide credible information that the armed groups value about who is participating in the conflict and who is not. And so just by having this agreement and this information mechanism, you can limit violence in two different ways. So first, you can keep armed groups from mistakenly killing people who might have defected to who were suspected of defecting to an armed group. And so instead of people thinking that someone was guilty of some crime of aiding the insurgents or aiding a paramilitary group, you can clarify that actually, no, you have the wrong guy, or no, this person did not actually participate. Someone's starting rumors about them for some other domestic dispute. So you can actually clarify that and persuade the armed groups to not use violence to resolve that case. And then second, just by having this information and civilians knowing about this information, it increases the costs to civilians for aiding armed groups. So there's a greater risk that they might get caught for providing aid to an armed group. And one very clear example of this is the local institution of the Peasant Workers Association of the Carari River, which is in the middle of Colombia. And I've documented this process quite extensively, and it'll be in a forthcoming paper of mine if people are interested. So one area where the dialogue with armed groups and attempts to resolve threats often occur is at least in Colombia, are in areas where armed groups often come to have meetings with communities. And so this is an example of a multi-sport court that you find frequently across the Colombian countryside, or what they call a polideportivo, so a multi-sport court. And often this is the biggest area where people can meet. And if there are organized civilians, they can effectively negotiate with the armed actors to resolve threats. So oftentimes they can persuade armed groups to change their norms about the use of violence, or persuade them to obey civilian rules about monitoring individuals, and just persuade them not to kill at once, but to make sure that someone, whether someone is or is not participating in a conflict. Okay, so the fourth strategy, perhaps one that's more well known to people in our audience, is protest and reputation effects. And so even in these violent conditions, you see civilians using very public demonstrations of dissatisfaction with violence to try to impose costs on armed actors and draw outside attention to deter the use of violence. And you see this in a number of ways. So first of all, a lot of communities such as the peace zones, peace communities, humanitarian spaces, they make formal declarations of neutrality. So they say, we want to be autonomous, neutral, we're not supporting any armed group. Second, you see a lot of dialogue, you see moral appeals to armed groups, and even rhetorical traps. So you see civilians trying to leverage previous statements within different armed groups' ideologies to essentially guilt them into not using violence or shame them into not using violence. So you also see very public acts of denouncing aggression, of protesting, of marching, to essentially shame armed actors very publicly. You also see that even just the threat of protest, so you sometimes don't even have to protest, but if you can threaten that you can pull off a massive protest if armed groups commit some kind of transgression, that sometimes can be effective. Let's say if you have a history of protest, you can use that for negotiation power. And then also in Colombia, particularly, but in even some other locations, there's mass nonviolent manpower and unarmed guards. And so oftentimes you can see communities mobilizing so many people that they can literally surround belligerents and armed actors and persuade them to either give up kidnapped victims or to withdraw from an area. So this is an especially strong kind of strategy. Another way that protest is used is to draw outside accompaniment from NGOs and from external actors. And so the thinking is that if there are external actors, they can increase the costs and increase the spotlight on armed actors if they use violence. So one note about these protest effects is that even stating neutral intentions of communities can be viewed as hostile. So this is can be an effective strategy, but sometimes this is a last resort strategy because it can entail some risks. And so here's just a case of marching against violence in Colombia. This is quite common where you see a lot of protests against violence. You also see this in many other countries as well. So public voicing of outrage or of public voicing of the desire for peace. So some just brief examples around the world where you see these kinds of protest and reputation effects. And so in the summer of 2012, the NASA indigenous group of Colombia had some very large protests where they surrounded a Colombian military base and actually protested quite strongly and physically carried off some soldiers to express their dissatisfaction that the military base was making the community targets of the FARC insurgents. So they had unarmed guards who protested quite forcefully. Also, in many villages in Afghanistan, you see residents upset with the Taliban, upset with NATO and ISAF, and essentially protesting all sides that they just want to run their own affairs. So there are a number of protests in Afghanistan against violence as well. So. Okay, the last strategy I'm going to document today are early warning systems. This is a fairly simple concept. So essentially the idea is that information networks help provide civilians with early warning of combat, and this in turn helps them avoid violence. And so oftentimes with this information, civilians can convince armed actors to fight outside the boundaries of their settlements, fight somewhere else, or civilians can take action to temporarily displace or shelter residents until fighting has subsided. And so this is a strategy that requires organization and information to carry that out. And these kinds of systems may be set up either just within the community among residents or through dialogues with combatants about protecting civilians. And so you see examples of early warning systems in the Congo. Even in Syria, there's television stations providing information about conflict. And in Colombia, communities have developed local warning systems. So again here, information is power. And so here's just a idyllic Colombian town. You can imagine this town leveraging its cooperative relationships to get warning in case combat were to occur here. People could either displace or try to persuade armed groups that if they're going to fight, they should battle elsewhere. Okay, so let's do a quick comparison of the different strategies. And I think there are really two ways of thinking about what are the determinants of strategic choice. One of these is the contentiousness of armed group strategies. And so Tilly, McAdam, and Taro present this idea. And the thinking here is that these strategies have different organizational requirements, but they also vary in the costs that they impose on armed groups, armed actors, and they also have different risks in terms of retaliation from armed groups. And so we can think about a continuum of contentiousness, which I will display in a moment. But also we have just ideas and cultural predispositions for particular approaches. So one community may have strong ideologies for nonviolence. Another may have experience protesting for, let's say, economic benefits, and so they're used to protesting for their rights. And so you can see those kinds of factors determining when different strategies are likely to be used. And so this is a slide which may or may not do justice to how you might array these strategies, but you could essentially think about these strategies varying on a scale from low contentiousness to high contentiousness, where low would be displacing or exactly doing nothing, has no organizational requirements, civilians can leave and don't impose many costs on armed groups. This can go all the way down to protest and armed resistance, where you're actively imposing costs on armed groups. It requires great organization, and it also might risk retaliation. And so theoretically we can consider whether organizational requirements are increasing as you increase in the contentiousness of strategies, whether the costs on armed groups increase with contentiousness, and whether the risk of retaliation increases in contentiousness. And so the question then is, for a particular type of conflict condition, does greater contentiousness of a strategy yield greater protection? So I'm not going to answer that. This is a very complex question, but it's something to think about. So is it necessarily the best thing to use a contentious strategy or not? I will note that oftentimes communities may start with some of the less contentious strategies, and if those strategies aren't working, or if they are still suffering violence, then they may use other strategies on the continuum of contentiousness to have stronger effects. Okay, so I'm getting close to wrapping up here. I'm just going to talk now about the logics of armed actor responses. And some of these logics of why armed actors respond to different strategies come from interviews I've conducted in Colombia with members of insurgents and members of paramilitary groups, so demobilized combatants, provided some insights about how they might be affected by these civilian strategies. And so one is simply that some of the strategies provide fewer inroads to communities and fewer resources for armed groups. But different armed actors also mentioned moral considerations. So they don't want to necessarily end an entire village, or attacking an organized village might mean greater moral costs that are suffered. There are also a number of rhetorical traps and inconsistencies with rebel ideologies. So oftentimes rebels may say that they're for the peasantry or for some particular part of the population, and then if civilians leverage actions to the contrary, leverage statements about their actions that go against their ideology, they can in a sense persuade them otherwise and to behave more respectfully. Also, one factor that came up in several different ways is the reputation of these armed groups, which can make it harder for them to achieve their objectives. And the reputations come into play really with three different audiences. Local audiences, so is committing violence in one village going to make it harder to deal with other populations who might resist? Is excessive violence going to make it more difficult for international supporters of the armed group to continue their support because they're worried about supporting an excessively violent group? And also, oftentimes in civil conflicts, militaries are absent or weak or not consistently present. But if excessive violence is occurring in a zone, the military may be drawn to that region, which would impose an additional cost. And so to the extent that organizations enhance these reputational effects, they can intensify those kinds of processes. Other times, armed groups said it's not worth the marginal gains to attack a village. So sometimes an organized village may not be of much gain, and it may be very costly. So that's one other issue. And then there could be fissures within armed groups about the uses of violence. So some members of the group may be more violent than others, and so civilians can cause tensions within the armed groups about using violence. And so one schematic where you can see or how armed groups might array or might line up is in terms of the dimensions of contestation on the battlefield, so the vertical axis there, and then the resource bases of these armed groups, so whether or not groups are highly ideological and committed to not using violence against civilians, or whether groups are opportunistic abusers and don't have many restraints. And so you could think about groups that are hybrid being groups where strategies might most affect the use of violence. And this could be because these kinds of groups both have some motivation to use violence, so they're not purely ideological or they're not in a purely controlled zone. And they also may be susceptible to civilian strategies. So there could be some people in the group who disagree with the use of violence, and so the civilians help them make a choice not to, or civilians help resolve the problems that an armed group might face in a contested area of identifying combatants. So they might provide the information they need to manage security in a contested zone. So now I'd like to conclude the presentation and just provide a few summary points and recap some of the arguments I've made. And so I think the key point here is that civilians can exercise agency even in these hostile settings. And so it's not just that civilians are capable of protesting repressive regimes or protesting for their rights, but even in very dangerous settings, there are ways that civilians can come together and deal with violence. Community organization and cooperation are really the key here. I've identified them as the means through which civilians can implement these diverse nonviolent protection strategies. And so variation in organization is a key factor to take into account. So third, there's a note on conditions. And so the strategies that civilians use will have the highest odds of success when they are appropriately adapted to the communities. And so they have to be adapted in terms of the existing cooperation levels, what the community can manage, what kinds of conflict conditions they're facing, and what types of threats they're facing. And so, for example, you might think that the investigations mechanism I outlined is probably more useful when dealing with selective violence, while protest could possibly be more useful when dealing with abusive groups to shame them into disciplining their members. A very important thing to note is that these nonviolent strategies may entail risks, and so there really does have to be a careful calculation of when they're appropriate and when they can be used. They should not be recommended as a panacea. These are some of the strategies that have been used in the past and possibly could be adapted to new situations. And so really we have to consider what are the conditions for success, what are the armed actor motivations, and what are their likely responses for these different strategies. So with that, I'm going to conclude and thank you all for listening, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Kaplan. So as I mentioned before, we're going to start with the Q&A session right now. We already have some questions coming in. So as a reminder, there's two different ways. If you have a microphone, you can click the raise hand button, and you can also actually call in that way if you don't have a microphone. And I can unmute you, and you'll be able to ask your question on air. Or, as some people have already done, you can type into the questions panel, and I will read that out loud for you. And just to start off, Oliver, I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on some of the main differences you might see concerning the dynamics of resistance movements against violence, as opposed to other kind of more resistance movements you might see, sort of more typical, say, for political rights or against corruption, where the risk of violence is much less.
Yeah, that's right. So that's a really good question. So oftentimes, well, one, collective action is much more difficult facing those kinds of risks, and so second, the strategies have to be much more calibrated and cautious. There's a much greater risk to failure, and so you oftentimes see many more quiet backroom discussions of maybe how to manage the community or how to resolve disputes that are going on, or perhaps very cautious dialogue with armed actors, as opposed to the protest or other movements or other strategies, excuse me, because those might entail great risks. And so the point of the the dogs that don't bark, so that the point that I brought up on the first slide there is part of the reason why these movements are very hard to document, because oftentimes they're occurring in very quiet areas, and by definition these are areas far from government power, precisely because you're fighting a conflict there, and so you don't always see what's going on, whereas the other kinds of protests that are occurring perhaps in a capital city against government institutions where there's press access. So in that sense, they share some similarities, but they also have some pretty sharp differences.
Our next question is from Lisa, who was wondering if you could elaborate on the role of women in leadership in these approaches to nonviolent strategies against violence.
Okay, great. Thanks for the question, Lisa. So the role of women. Women play extremely important roles in these communities in different ways. I think it's probably unfortunate to say that across a lot of communities, and especially rural communities, women are not typically as empowered as men, but in a number of communities they are. And in fact, they play very important, first, behind-the-scenes roles. So they often manage their families, play important roles in their communities to provide activities and opportunities for youth so that they don't go toward armed groups. But they also play some very formal roles. And so in a number of communities that I've visited, women were part of the village councils. Women acted as conciliators. And oftentimes women communicate a lot more with each other and really play important roles in terms of information networks and sort of this other background dynamic. And sometimes they're targeted less than men, so they're assumed to be less hostile, and so in that sense they're able to play particular roles that men are not able to play. That's really an excellent question, and definitely could use more research on that. So thank you for bringing it up, Lisa.
Okay, our next question's from Kiama. Kiama asks sort of a comment followed by a question. Some of the organizational characteristics of civilian organizations which you highlighted are actually what the armed groups fight for, i.e. legitimacy, economic empowerment. In this case, do you think this could be the reason why civilian organization strategies endear to the armed groups at the grassroots level?
Sorry, did you say endear? Endear the civilians to armed groups?
Yes.
So I think Kiama raises a good point that there are armed groups that are fighting for the rights of peasants and fighting for, greater representation, greater economic inclusion, those kinds of things. Often those kinds of armed groups, they tend to be the ones that are committing less violence. Now, before people jump on me for that statement, obviously armed groups they often say one thing and they do another, right? So you have armed groups that may say that they're for the rights of the peasants or, for greater economic equality, for political rights, but oftentimes they end up using violence. And so the question there is, can civilians really retain legitimacy? And oftentimes, if the armed group is respectful by nature, they will defer to a well-organized civilian community and respect that legitimacy. So in the sense, the legitimacy of armed groups actually can help the civilians to manage their communities better. The really important point to keep in mind about the civilian organizations and their legitimacy is that civilians are in conflict situations, are by nature dealing with very unstable conditions. And so part of the problem is they don't know who's going to be in control tomorrow, whether or not that group that was just pushed out of this town is going to come back next month. And so it really is important for them to have these organizations managing security, managing information, and keeping aware of the conflict because the conditions are changing, and so they have to adapt to changing conditions. So it's not always that a legitimate group is going to be there. They may be there one day and gone tomorrow. So.
Great. Next question is from Carl, who was wondering if the type of government in place in the country that these struggles are going on has an impact on the success of such efforts. And the three examples he mentions are Mexico, Iran, and Syria, and struggles there that might be against violence.
So I couldn't catch if that was Carl or Kara. So
Carl.
Whoever you want. Carl. So okay, thank you, Carl. So the type of government certainly can have an impact on, first of all, whether or not a civil war may break out, but also how that government may deal with an armed conflict and how much they may respect civilians. And so Iran itself, in the moment, is not experiencing a civil conflict. So for the moment, this may not be as relevant for that case, but certainly Syria and Mexico, you see quite different responses where the Syrian government has used massive violence against its own citizens, has not been responsive, if at all, to civilian strategies for protection, even though civilians in Syria are quite active. In Mexico, recent statements you see from officials is that they would, of course, like to provide security and legitimate security, but they recognize that civilian movements. I think I may be losing audio. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can still hear you.
Okay. I think it cut out for a minute there. So in Mexico, and even in Colombia itself, so for a time in both countries, the armed forces were quite large perpetrators of violence, but have since, at least in Colombia, reformed to some extent, and so they have some respect towards civilian movements and acknowledgement of that. In Mexico right now, you see civilians taking actions for their own security, in some cases arming, and the authorities would like to come in and provide better security, but they realize that in the meantime, that they acknowledge that these movements are going on, and for them, they feel it's very important that these movements, if they're going to use force, use it legitimately and appropriately, and themselves don't use force excessively. So, but this does raise a good question. So, how do countries differ in their uses of force and uses of violence, and also in their respect for civilian institutions? And so civilian institutions may be respected or not respected in a number of countries, but one key factor is often the strength of the central state. And so if the central state is weak or does not have good reach, oftentimes they may not even be a player interacting with these local communities. It may be a whole different set of armed actors. On the other hand, so democracy itself may increase the accountability of the armed forces so that they aren't able to use the kind of violence that they use in other countries, and in fact are required to respect their citizens more. So it may provide greater openings for peaceful movements.
Next up we have Bridget, who is going to be unmuted right now, and we'll ask her question.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, but I'm probably muted, so yes. Hi, Bridget, go ahead.
You're not muted. I heard your response.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great.
I want to say first, thank you so much for this work you've done. I think it's critically important. I wanted to ask about the roles and relationships of outsiders trying to support or wanting to support community-led nonviolent strategies, because I think there is a presumption that outside intervention is often military in form. It's often the assumption that outsiders are needed to come in and protect civilians. And so I wanted to ask sort of what have you found in your research to be the right or best or some success stories of outsiders supporting local community-led efforts, and how can outsiders be most helpful?
Okay, this is a great question, and kind of has to do with one of the policy implications of this work. So how can outsiders support local communities? Essentially, that's the question. So thanks, Bridget. That's a great question. I've come across this in a number of ways in my work. One of the most frequent kinds that you see is what's called accompaniment. And so there are different NGOs in the U.S. and abroad, such as Peace Brigades, to name one, Fellowship of Reconciliation, another one, Witness for Peace, these kinds of organizations. There are other NGOs, even certain state institutions are charged with defending community rights, and so they play this kind of role. And also the UN, they play a big role. So UN, Office of Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs, UNDP, those are all organizations that try to play supporting roles. Now, I'm sorry if this answer isn't going to be extremely satisfactory, but there actually is not very good conventional wisdom on how outsiders can best support communities. And so one clear way is just providing them resources, helping them meet, giving them the technology they need to communicate. That kind of stuff can be very very important. Oftentimes exchanging lessons with other communities, that kind of knowledge is very important. In terms of accompaniment, they do some of that, but they're also there to be human rights observers, so almost like the unarmed peacekeepers monitoring community conditions. And so they sometimes come in, work with organized communities to be extra eyes and ears. And the thinking there is that, one, if you have foreigners or outsiders there, the community is going to be less likely to be targeted because of the costs that may entail to armed groups. And two, they're better able to broadcast news of abuses and really shame the armed groups and perhaps bring international legal action. And so that's what the companies are trying to do. It's a totally different question as to whether and when that works, and it's a very hard question to study. I think probably the most important thing to keep in mind is that these decisions, they entail risks. Regardless of what they are, they entail different risks. And the communities themselves really need to take the decisions on their own, and they need to take them collectively and inclusively, because these community decisions could put different individuals at risk, and some individuals may have different risk tolerances for the kinds of retaliation that might occur. So it's really important that these kinds of options be fairly presented to communities. If outsiders are going to help, the presentation of what that entails be fair and be well understood, and that the ultimate choice be left up to the community to make that decision of how do they want to manage their security, do they want to work with outsiders. So it's really important that outsiders don't come in sort of offering things or promising things that they can't end up delivering on, because again, this is a very dangerous situation, and outsiders, especially if they're coming in without weapons, so they're coming in as human rights observers or some other thing, they have limits to what they can do as well. So that's my answer to that question. But again, this is another question that requires additional empirical research to really understand what outsiders are able to do in a constructive way.
All right, we're just coming up on just over an hour, so we only have time for about one or two more questions. So I have one from my colleague, Maciej Bartkowski, who was wondering if you could describe how do the villagers plan their strategies? In other words, do they have meetings, open meetings, where everybody comes to voice their opinions, or sort of how are discussions moderated? How is decision-making organized?
Okay, good question. Thanks, Maciej. So how do civilians plan these strategies and actually come together? And so this really gets back to the question of collective action, which I described in sort of general terms, where I argued that pre-existing organizations and sort of pre-existing networks, social links, social cohesion are very helpful for community members to know each other, know who they can count on, and be able to make decisions. In terms of how this process actually unfolds, having lead time to know about threat situations and then respond to them is very important. So to the extent that there's early warning or early information or only a gradual escalation, this provides civilians more time to make decisions. And you can see this in a number of communities in Colombia where they either get threats of some kind, or armed actors say, if you don't do this, we're going to come in and do X, or do X kind of repression against you. And so in those kinds of cases, civilians come together. Often it's very quiet, because if they tip their hand before everybody is coordinated on a strategy, depending on what that is, it can be dangerous. But oftentimes, in some of the communities that I've studied, the members will have some kind of backroom quiet discussion of some of the leaders or the elders of that community, and they'll think through some of the options. So if we armed, what would happen? If we protested, what would happen? Are we willing to take those risks? And in some cases, what you hear is that the violence is either so bad, or people are so committed to staying in their homes that they're willing to take on quite high levels of risk in terms of how armed actors might respond to their strategy or to their protest. So, but the point is, these kinds of decision-making processes differ from one place to another. A key factor in this decision-making is what set of knowledge do these communities have on hand. And so one role that I think research plays in an important sense is diagnosing and evaluating empirically the effects of these strategies. So what is the menu of options available to communities that they could possibly take? Because you can't implement strategies that you don't know about. And so oftentimes NGOs who coordinate different communities or who meet with communities are able to work with them to say, well, at least on some of the more subtle weapons of the week, well, how can we manage the community better? Can you resolve disputes? These are some of the techniques that have been used in other communities to resolve disputes, to keep youth from being recruited. Maybe these are things you might think about. And so those kinds of information networks can be very useful, and those are only growing in their reach. So I think that's a good thing. So thanks, Matcha.
We have time for just one more question, and we're going to go with Alexandra. Alexandra, you can go ahead. Are you there? No. Okay. We'll go with one last one that was written in by Natalia, who asks, what is the role of mass media and potentially citizen journalism as a nonviolent actor to stop or prevent violence within these movements?
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Natalia, for that question. So what's the role of mass media and journalism as a strategy? I think this plays a number of really important roles. And so the first role is one that I sort of just mentioned, is that the more that we get reports of how communities in far-flung regions are responding to armed groups and how they're doing that in different ways, and the more detail we have of each of these processes, the more we can learn about how civilians effectively deal with armed groups or sometimes fail in their dealings with armed groups. And these provide really important lessons for communities around the world, and they can think about what are the conditions in that community versus our community, how might this strategy play out. And you hear this many times. So in one community I visited, they heard about indigenous, this was a campesino peasant community, but they'd heard about indigenous protests, and so they said, you know what, would this be something that we could do in our community, and can we run that kind of strategy? So they were actually thinking about that strategy, and they decided that actually they were not organized enough to do what the indigenous groups were doing, and so, but those kinds of information flows are crucial. The mass media also plays a very important role by essentially leveraging up the power of shaming and protest. And so protests are much more effective and have much greater consequences on groups if they are reported on widely, if there's outside audiences paying attention. And so the press plays a really important role in those cases. However, we do want to keep in mind that there are cases when vocal protest is not the appropriate or perhaps least risky strategy. And so in those cases, communities will try to keep their strategies quiet to avoid provoking a response from armed groups. So really a great question. Journalism, very important, and in fact that's how I've learned a lot myself about these movements across the world, because it just can't be everywhere. So again, thank you, Natalia.
Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. We still have a lot of questions left. I see Juan, Mary, Sharon, Jonathan, Jung, Alexandra, and a couple others that we just don't have time to get to, but I will forward those to you, Oliver, and include that to them so that they can see, and hopefully you'll have a chance to get to those. And if anyone else has any other follow-up questions, please do forward those to us.
Okay, great. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in today and listening, and I hope you found the presentation valuable. So thanks again for all the great questions.
Okay, thank you, Oliver. That was very enlightening, and this is a topic that not a lot of research has been done on, so we're very happy to have you present on that today. Just to wrap up, was there anything else, any closing remarks or anything else you wanted to mention before we finish?
I think I covered all my bases, so yeah, no, I'd just like to thank everybody, and really, really good questions. And I guess the final comment I'll say is that this is really a wide open field. We still know very little, so the more evidence people can provide on this topic, the better. So.
Great, and as a reminder to everyone, this has been recorded, so if you joined us late or if you want to forward this to somebody else who couldn't join, it'll be on our website at nonviolent-conflict.org, and then click on the Learning and Resources tab on the website to see the webinar series. And if you had any additional questions you think of afterwards, you can email them to us, as I mentioned, webinar at nonviolent-conflict.org. And we'll also upload the slides, the presentation slides, along with the video of the presentation. And as I've done in the last couple presentations, I just want to mention a couple new things that we're doing in addition to that Rutgers course, online course that I mentioned at the beginning. First off, we just launched an iPhone app. It was just updated. You can see all the webinars there, along with all of our conflict summaries, which are short, couple-page summaries of different nonviolent conflicts that are going on all around the world. It's free, so just you can go to iTunes Store to download it and type People Power, and you can also just use the URL that I've listed up on the slide you see right here. Second, we just launched an online learning Moodle platform called the Universal E-Classroom, which is a structured online curriculum on civil resistance. And you can email that to me, or you can also go to our website and click again on educational initiatives to sign up for that. And it has over 40 individual sessions on different aspects of nonviolent struggle. So it's a great resource for teaching and learning about it. And finally, you can come find us on Facebook or Twitter using the two links you see up there, facebook.com/nonviolentconflict. On Twitter, we are at NVConflict. And you can find Oliver at Oliver Kaplan. And that's it for today. We have more webinars coming up soon, so be sure to check back on our website. And we'll also be sending out emails, tweeting, all that. So that's it. Thank you so much, Dr. Kaplan, for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, and we hope to see you soon.